Does virginity matter? Well, some people certainly think so. A few years ago, a famous American rapper went on a podcast and mentioned that every year he took his teenage daughter to the gynecologist to have her hymen checked to confirm she was still a virgin. He framed it as a way to protect and defend his daughter from danger, and that he was willing to go above and beyond for her safety. His comment went viral online, and most of the responses that I saw were overwhelmingly negative, with many gynecologists stepping in to explain that the hymen cannot prove virginity. Back in 2018, the World Health Organization announced that virginity testing was a violation of human rights, stating that these tests have no scientific or clinical basis in proving whether someone had had intercourse. This obsession with proving female virginity is not new. It is not uniquely American, not uniquely Chinese, and it shows up across cultures, across centuries. Hi everyone, I'm Amy. Today, let's look at how the concern with virginity played out in ancient China. This video is not about criticizing chastity itself. Instead, we will see how virginity became socially important in Chinese history, and the strange ways people tried to verify it. Based on my understanding of world history, it appears that virginity had mattered in some shape or form in many ancient civilizations. In ancient Athens, female sexuality was tightly controlled due to concerns regarding legitimacy. In ancient Rome, the Vestal Virgins, a group of priestesses who maintained the sacred fire of the goddess Vesta, were required to maintain celibate for 30 years of service. Their chastity was not just a personal matter. It was believed that Rome itself was protected by their purity, and that if a Vestal broke her vow, the city would suffer. A Vestal found guilty of breaking her vow was buried alive. The Hebrew Bible contains procedures for what happened when a husband claims his new wife was not a virgin. The bride's parents are required to produce evidence of her virginity before the elders of the city. If the accusation is upheld, she could be stoned to death at her father's door. In many C-dramas and modern depictions of traditional Chinese culture, a woman's virginity is often framed in very strict terms of chastity, purity, and family honor. But it was not always that extreme. For the earlier periods of Chinese history, chastity was praiseworthy, but not more valuable than your life. Early Confucian ideas did promote modesty and sexual exclusivity for women, and a woman who became pregnant out of wedlock could absolutely damage her family's reputation and marriage prospects. Virginity mattered, but it sat within a broader moral framework where other things also mattered, and where the consequences of not being a virgin, while unpleasant, were not necessarily fatal. In the Han Dynasty, widow remarriage was common and largely unremarkable. Premarital relationships definitely existed, and the Tang Dynasty was probably the most socially relaxed period in Chinese history when it comes to sex and marriage. Women wore low-cut necklines, rode horses, played sports. Divorce and remarriage were relatively common, and some records suggest over 20% of Tang Dynasty princesses married more than once. Premarital and extramarital love affairs show up in Tang Dynasty stories and anecdotes, often framed romantically rather than as something purely scandalous. In these earlier dynasties, virginity was actually not clearly documented as a requirement to enter the imperial harem, which is contrary to what we may see in C-drama today. Some historical records do present virginity as desirable, but it was not as important as politics, family, background, and beauty. Even the female emperor Wu Zetian started out as a concubine for Emperor Taizong, and then later became a concubine to his son, Emperor Gaozong. It was definitely considered to be scandalous, and some court officials did complain about it. But it was ultimately accepted. It wasn't that nobody cared about a woman's chastity. It was just less of a life or death situation, and more of a that's naughty kind of situation. So what changed? Well, the ideology started to change with the Song Dynasty. More specifically, it was related to the philosophical movement called Neo-Confucianism, Li Xue. This school of thought placed enormous new emphasis on female restraint, moral order, and social hierarchy. What changed was not the introduction of entirely new values, but the sheer intensity and rigidity in which existing ones were enforced. It was said that starving to death is a minor matter, but losing chastity is a serious matter. This saying would be often used as a fundamental principle of Neo-Confucianism, repeated and used to justify devastating consequences for women across centuries. From the Song dynasty onward, female chastity became increasingly tied to family honor, marriage prospects, and sometimes whether a woman would survive at all. And that is when attempts to verify virginity became much more intense and socially important. And if a woman was found to not be a virgin when she was expected to be a virgin, there could be serious consequences. This was not a sudden, overnight change, but we start to see growing concern over moral purity, proper conduct, and family reputation. The imperial harem also became more regulated and bureaucratic over time, with increasingly detailed system for selecting and screening women. By the Ming Dynasty, the wedding night carried a specific and well-understood social weight. If a bride was found not to be a virgin, her husband's family had established social and sometimes legal grounds to send her back to her parents. This came with serious practical consequences: the return of the bride price, demand for financial compensation, and a public dissolution of the marriage. For her family, this was not just humiliating. Depending on their financial situation and social standing, it could be ruinous. For the woman herself, the consequences could go much further than shame. Some periods and regions of the Ming Dynasty actually saw village-based family clans enforced their own customary laws to punish women deemed immoral, by methods ranging from public humiliation to death. Hanging and drowning are specifically mentioned as methods used against women whose chastity was questioned. The founding emperor of the Ming Dynasty, Zhu Yuanzhang, personally decreed that if a widow lost her husband before the age of 30 and did not remarry, remaining chaste until the age of 50, her family would be exempted from compulsory labor requirements. The government was literally offering incentives for families to pressure their women into lifelong chastity. By the Ming and Qing dynasties, the standards had become much stricter. Girls selected for the imperial harem were expected to come from respectable families and to be sexually virtuous. Palace selection systems investigated family reputation, moral conduct, and physical condition before women could enter the palace. Later Ming Dynasty anecdotes and accounts describe invasive physical screening before entry into the imperial harem. While many of the dramatic virgin inspection scenes shown in C-dramas are probably exaggerated or fictional, the underlying expectation itself was very real. By the late imperial period, virginity had become an important part of what made a woman suitable for the imperial harem. A Qing Dynasty record tells the story of a servant girl named Guinyu, who hanged herself for chastity-related shame during the reign of Emperor Qianlong. Not because she had actually been assaulted, but because a man had simply repeatedly threatened that he would grab her and harass her. The mere public suggestion of sexual impropriety, even without any act taking place, was enough to destroy her reputation and drive her to end it. By the Qing Dynasty, the government was issuing formal commendations for chastity, erecting stone memorial arches called 贞节牌坊 in women's communities, and even exempting the families of chaste widows from certain taxes. These arches still stand across China today. They're carved in stone and they're beautiful. And each one of them represents a woman whose life was shaped, constrained, or ended by the demand that her body remain exclusively for one man. Within this world, the question of whether a new bride was a virgin was not a private matter between two people. It was a family matter, a community matter, and by extension, a matter that the imperial state had expressed opinion about in law. So how did they test for virginity in ancient China? Basically, there were three main methods of testing for virginity that we can see from Chinese historical records and literary sources. The simplest and most common method was the white cloth. I believe this was widely used in Europe as well. A white cloth or handkerchief would be placed beneath the bride on the wedding night. If blood appeared, it was taken as proof of virginity. This blood was called 落红, meaning fallen red. Some records describe how the groom would proudly show the blood-stained cloth to parents and guests waiting outside the bridal chamber. Families could send formal notices to the bride's family the next morning to report the result. Some texts describe specific ceremonial phrases used in these messages, languages about the household gate being in order, the new wife being worthy of honor. The bride's family would receive this news with relief and pride. If there was no blood, though, the consequences could be immediate and severe. But of course, this way of checking was easy to get around. A famous Qing dynasty story speaks of a woman who had a relationship before her marriage. When her wedding day came, her mother taught her exactly what to do. She was to hide chicken blood wrapped in rough paper, and when a moment came, use it in place of 落红. It was motherly advice, passed down the way you might pass down a recipe. And as you may already know, the white cloth test is meaningless. Some women bleed very little or not at all during first intercourse. Others may have experienced hymen tearing years earlier from physical activity, riding horses, or vigorous labor. Hymen shape and elasticity vary so much between individuals that bleeding on a wedding night is not reliable evidence of anything. And it seems that some people in these time periods understood this. The Qing dynasty novel 崇明漫录 tells this story. A girl of 12 or 13 wearing split crouch trousers was playing by riding on a hoe handle, bouncing on it for fun, and then went away. An old man noticed fresh blood on the handle, recognized it as 落红, and quietly kept it without telling anyone. Years later, when the girl had grown and married, and her husband doubted her chastity, the old man produced the hoe handle, and the husband was satisfied. The story was meant as a positive one, but what it actually showed me was how completely arbitrary the entire system was. A 12-year-old girl's entire future reputation rested on whether a stranger happened to notice a bloodstain on a farming tool years earlier, and how would anyone know that the blood on that particular tool came from that particular girl? The next documented method centers on a figure called the 稳婆, which means midwife. 稳婆were a recognized profession in Imperial China, whose primary role was delivering babies and assisting with women's health. But they also functioned in legal and social capacities, and in cases involving questions about a woman's body, a 稳婆could be called to examine her and provide testimony with a degree of official weight. In practice, it was believed that a 稳婆's examination worked on two levels. The first was physical, examining the genitalia and assessing the condition of the hymen. The second was observational, taking note of a woman's posture, skin condition, general demeanor, and facial features. This second part drew on the same physiognomy tradition that read through much of ancient Chinese thought. The 5 facial features, or 五官, meaning the eyes, eyebrows, mouth, ears, and nose, were each assessed for what face-reading tradition believed they could reveal about a person's character and chastity. Later stories of elaborate palace examinations, with officials inspecting every part of a woman's body in great detail, are largely questioned by historians today, and appear to come from fictional or unreliable sources rather than documented court practice. Modern medicine tells us that there was probably very little that a 稳婆could actually determine through her examination. Hymen condition varies so much between individuals that visual inspection tells you essentially nothing about sexual history. But regardless of that, midwife examinations were a real practice, documented in a historical record, and taken seriously by the people who used them. Next, let's talk about the famous gecko mark, 手工纱. This was a red mark placed on a young woman's arm when she was a girl, which would supposedly stay there until she had sexual relations. If you have watched Chinese historical dramas, you have probably seen some versions of this in the show. The concept appears all over the place in Chinese fiction, and the idea itself does appear in real ancient Chinese texts and traditions. Some accounts suggest earlier dynasties did apply this gecko mark to court women, although we do not know how systematically it was used. The earliest written reference appears in the Huainan Wanbi Shu, compiled under Liu An, king of Huainan, during the Western Han Dynasty. The text describes feeding a gecko cinnabar until its body turns completely red, then grinding it into powder and applying it to a woman's skin. The mark will remain permanently, the text claims, and will only disappear if she has intercourse. The Jing Dynasty text, Bo Wu Zhi by Zhang Hua, repeats this with more detail, specifying 7 jing of cinnabar, and attributes the method to the court official Dongfang Shuo, who supposedly told it to Emperor Wu of the Han. A Song Dynasty source traces a version back to Qin Shi Huang, who allegedly used it to monitor palace women. But what I found really interesting is that even ancient Chinese scholars were questioning if this gecko mark even did anything. The Tang Dynasty medical text, Xingqiu Bencao, specifically describes the gecko mark as unreliable. Then, in the Ming Dynasty, the physician Li Shizhen reviewed existing sources describing the gecko mark and concluded that the claims were largely untrue. I mean, we probably already knew that there was no way the gecko mark could work as described, but I guess it does make a cool story on the screen. The 3 methods that I just talked about were the 3 methods that historians are pretty sure were actually used in Chinese history. But today, we see references to several other methods of verification that appear to have been created through folklore or fictional stories. One of the more commonly seen tests was the eyebrow and breast test. The belief was that a virgin's eyebrow lie flat against the brow bone, while a non-virgin's stand upright, and that a virgin's breasts are firm and elevated, while a non-virgin's would become soft and drooping. In the famous Yuan Dynasty play, Romance of the Western Chamber, Xi Xiang Ji, a story is told of a scholar named Zhang Shen and a noblewoman named Cui Yingying who pursue a secret affair and eventually marry. It was celebrated as one of China's great love stories and also criticized during the Qing Dynasty for depicting a couple consummating their love without parental approval. In the play, after Zhang Shen and Cui Yingying's first night together, Cui Yingying's mother observes that her daughter's bearing and manner have changed. Her speech has become vague. Her spirit has shifted. Her waist and body bearing are different from before. This scene was read by later writers as evidence that loss of virginity produces detectable physical changes. The Qing Dynasty writer Jing Shen Tan, the same person who is credited with a famous interpretation of the back-pushing diagram prophecies that I covered in another video, left comments on the play, specifically identifying the use of a woman's eyebrow and breasts as an indicator of virginity. The scholar Ji Xiaolan, a court official under Emperor Qianlong of the Qing Dynasty, recorded a scene where multiple people used eyebrows and breasts as a shared evidence of a woman's chastity. It does appear that this test was used to a certain extent, but it was not documented in official records or medical texts. It does seem like it was widely believed in folklore, though. Then there is the sneeze test. A woman stands over a container of fine ash without undergarments. Pepper or smoke is used to make her sneeze. If the air expelled during the sneeze disturbs the ash, she is not a virgin. If the ash stays still, she is. This appears to have first appeared in the Ming Dynasty's fiction, Yu Shi Ming Yan, but there is no independent court record, palace regulation, or medical manual that confirms this method was ever used anywhere officially. Next is the horse hoof soil test. This method says that soil from a horse's hoof print is secretly placed in a woman's clothing collar, and if she has a secret sexual history, she will involuntarily reveal it in her speech. There is no science here. This was basically magic. And then there is the blood and water test. According to a story from the Qing Dynasty collection, Chongming Manlu, a young woman was accused of impropriety by a male relative, and she deliberately pricked a finger to drop the blood into water in front of her older female relative. The story claims that if the accused woman was a virgin, then her blood would bead up and not scatter. So this is actually a popular theory regarding a virgin's blood that was passed down through folklore. But there is no documented evidence of it actually being used as an established testing method. Maybe it was practiced in certain villages or regions, but it was never accepted as an official test in historical records. Some modern summaries of traditional Chinese virginity tests also mentioned a skull bone test, where the bone at the back of the skull was supposedly examined after death. In this folklore, pure white bone meant that she was a virgin. A black mark meant she had been with a man, and a completely black bone meant that she had been promiscuous. There is no evidence that this story was based on a real forensic practice, but it does tell us something interesting about traditional beliefs surrounding virginity, about the belief that sexual history must leave some kind of permanent physical trace. The Song Dynasty philosopher who said that starving to death is a minor matter, but losing chastity is a serious matter, probably could not have imagined the full weight of what those words would set in motion. Over the centuries, ideas about female chastity hardened into social expectations, family pressure, legal consequences, and sometimes even violence. Entire systems developed around the assumption that virginity had to leave behind proof, that somewhere on the body, in the blood, in behavior, or even in something as silly as ashes or gecko marks, there had to be some way to know. And what surprised me the most was that even in those pre-modern times, people were already questioning whether virginity testing actually worked. But despite the skepticism, the desire to verify virginity never really disappeared, because the tests themselves were never the real point. And while we live in a world of modern science today, the value placed on virginity still has not completely gone away. Even now, artificial hymens can still be purchased in many countries. Modern medicine has repeatedly stated that virginity cannot be scientifically proven through physical examination, but people continue to search for ways to prove it anyway. In some parts of the world, accusations surrounding virginity and sexual purity can still destroy reputations, end marriages, lead to violence, or even cost women their lives. The methods of checking and proving virginity may have changed, but the impulse behind them still remains. What did your culture say about virginity? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed today's topic, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks again for watching. I'll see you in the next one.
Stay curious, stay magical.